I'm Professor Ed Blakewood. This week, we're going to talk about a city facing a dynamic past and an important future, Santiago de Chile. I stand here at the presidential palace, not knowing what direction to turn and walk in, because behind me, you can see the beauties of the past in the plaza and the cathedral dating back to the 16th century. In front of me are the monstrous buildings of mineral boom that has created enormous wealth in this country and a movement toward American and Western culture that is moving very quickly. The direction that Santiago takes is an important one. And I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Barton, who's running the sustainability program at the Catholic University of Chile, to discuss where to, quo vadis, for Santiago. Stay with us. It's going to be interesting and entertaining. So, Jonathan, you're not Chile.
I'm English. I arrived in Chile 10 years ago.
10 years ago in Santiago.
Yes.
And you spoke Spanish before?
I came to do my PhD here in 1991. Met my wife in the National Library. She came to the UK, did a PhD, and then we came back.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. My show is about cities, and big cities in particular. Santiago is a very big city. Tell me a little bit about how big Santiago is.
We're talking about 7 million people.
7 million people.
And although the main expansion was in the 50s to 70s, it's tailing off slightly. But we have the big issue now about how concentrated the city is, about sprawl and transport issues, water problems.
Well, now this city, like many cities, started out with a core against a river.
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct.
And how's it expanded? Has the river been the expansion?
Absolutely. The main thoroughfare, which goes from the mountains down towards the coast on an east-west axis, is really the way in which the city's developed. And originally, the higher income areas, going back to the late 19th century, were downstream of the original centre. And then from about the 1950s, 60s, the higher income areas started moving up towards the mountains. And so we see lower income areas down towards the downstream and higher income areas upstream. And really since the 70s, 80s, it's sprawled north-south as well. So it's exploded. But that's a main transect of the city. It defines the city from high income to low income as you move downstream.
And I notice there's a beautiful boulevard that runs right along the river.
Yeah.
That defines it too, kind of east-west.
That's right. That's right.
It divides the city. Is it divided the city by income or just by geography?
Santiago is a hugely divided city in terms of social segregation. However, that's changed slightly in the last 10 years because higher income people move further up into the mountains, further east. But then planning regulation says you can't build above 1,000 meters. So we ran out of space for the higher income areas up into the mountains. So now some upper middle income groups have moved out to new areas. So if you look in some of the 34 municipalities that constitute the metropolitan area, actually segregation has reduced in some areas. The problem is these are gated communities. So gated communities of higher income have arrived, and there's a big debate amongst my colleagues and others about whether it's good or bad. There is an argument, well, this increases land values around the gated communities, it increases the prices of houses around these gated communities, it provides employment, domestic service, gardening, other activities. So there's a real issue about whether gated communities are good or bad. My personal feeling is that they're bad because they do act as just islands within these municipalities.
And they concentrate segregation.
They concentrate segregation, yeah. So the geography of segregation has changed. It's more micro level than saying, well, these are the higher income municipalities, these are lower income. That's changed. The geography of segregation has changed, but it's highly segregated and with gates and fences. So it's quite stark. And that reflects also the income distribution in Chile, which is appalling. In Latin America, it competes with Brazil and Colombia to have the poorest income distribution. So Chile is a high income country according to the World Bank, but the distribution is appalling.
Let's talk about that a bit, because people don't know much about Chile and its economy. It's mostly, like Australia, a mineral extractive economy, is it not?
Over 40% of exports from minerals, copper principally, but also other minerals as well. And then if you add processing of that, it gets even higher. But then we've also have other non-traditional export products such as aquaculture, salmon aquaculture, forestry, wine, fruit, etc.
The wine we know about.
Wine we know about. It's popular.
Competitive.
Yeah. So urban development is interesting. Santiago concentrates over 40% of the national population as well. So it draws all these natural resource exports from other regions, and all the benefits are concentrated in Santiago. So there's a huge problems about decentralization.
We know a little bit about that in Australia. You know, as our big cities are big from the wealth that comes from the interior.
Yeah.
So I want to step back for just a second. Santiago is not on the ocean.
No.
Now, how do you have a big city not on the ocean? Why did that happen?
It's the original city in a sense. This is where the conquistadors arrived when they came
across the
mountains or down from Peru at that point, and they settled. These are southern Spanish conquistadores, so they saw this space that was a bit of green, and they thought, well, this seems a reasonable place for cultivation, for habitation. But for a long time, the competition between Santiago and Valparaiso was very strong. Santiago was the administrative capital, but Valparaiso was the commercial capital. So in a sense, you could say, well, there's an issue about Canberra versus Sydney or whatever, and Valparaiso has always vied for supremacy, at least until the last 30 or 40 years, I'd say.
So Valparaiso, for those people who don't know, is on the water.
Yep.
It is a port city.
A port city.
Very much a port city, and a hilly city as well.
Yeah, which is another reason why it played against Valparaiso replacing Santiago, because there isn't enough space for expansion. So the geography of Valparaiso as a city, also its vulnerability to tsunami or
fires,
big earthquake in 1905 or 6, and I think the geography wasn't suitable for a big major city. So that was a limitation that it had, and Santiago has become this administrative capital. It feeds off the other regions and makes other regions very angry. So we have this problem of centrality, of being a primate city.
Now, you have a very large middle class in the city, an upper middle class. I've moved around the city. People are making their money on minerals in this city. Where's this money coming from? Trade? Where's it coming from?
I mean, I live in a wealthy municipality, and that municipality, which is a completely residential area, if you look at the registers, has something like 160,000 miners in it. So these companies, all the consultancies, the multiplier companies linked with mining are based in Santiago, and that money is reflected in incomes. We have very high salaries for a certain number of people. The actual mining workers, many of whom work in the north and live in Santiago, they go up every week. There's tremendous commuting of miners to the north, because the mining towns, Calama, Antofagasta, etc., aren't that attractive for living compared with.
So they're flying in.
They fly, so their families live here. Access to education is better, and there's tremendous commuting of miners. So all of this wealth is accumulated here. So the construction sector is based on mining income, effectively. So if you look at construction services, it's based on what's happening in mining, because really we're talking about a 10-year boom that's just tailed off this last year. I mean, copper prices have fallen tremendously in the last 3 or 4 months, but we've been living off a 10-year boom, not 10 years, perhaps 5, 8 years in copper prices. And you can see this in in all the mushrooming of high-rise and new housing developments.
So you have a boom and bust economy here?
And that's the risk linked with copper prices and particularly with Chinese demand for copper. So the relation of the Chilean economy was always linked to the US demand during the 20th century, and now it's clearly we're part of the Asian explosion, and China in particular for their demand for copper.
And no doubt about it, because the President of Korea is here.
President of Korea is
This
here.
very minute.
Yes. And Korea is an interesting partner. There's a bilateral trade agreement with Korea, but China will define the Chilean, not just the Chilean economy, but Chilean development over the next 50 years.
Well, there's something else that defines this economy. I've seen more universities here than I've seen almost anywhere outside of India. What's that about?
As you probably have seen over the last few years, there's education is the central political debate in the country, because under the dictatorship there's a tremendous privatization of education, not just at higher education level, but in also what was traditionally municipal run public education. There was privatization of that. So you have something called the municipally subsidized education. So you have private, municipal subsidized, which is a very big chunk of public education.
Are those high schools in essence?
These are high schools. These are primary and secondary education, whereby central funding by education ministry goes to private education providers. And we've seen a very strong weakening of the public, strictly public education offered by municipalities. That's become, unfortunately, weakened and relatively poor quality. And the whole debate is about how we finance education. And this goes from primary and pre-primary to nursery education all the way through. So that's the big debate, and the call of the students is for free education, because they've seen copper revenues over the last few years and said, well, we should be focusing on education. But what happened under dictatorship was this sprouting of private universities.
Yeah, and there's so many. There seem to be on every corner. Now, who do they serve? Are they serving Chileans? Are they serving Peruvians or Colombians or everyone around the world?
Pretty much Chileans. I mean, migration of Peruvians and Colombians, Bolivians has been very strong in the last 10 years, particularly in Santiago, but also further north, Antofagasta, for example, Copiapó. But it's mainly education for Chileans, and there's, if you like, great inflation in the sense that whereas a technical degree was sufficient before, and now it's actually a degree program, and people with degrees, so there's master's inflation. So in a sense, you could argue that Chilean education and the qualifications of generally across society are increasing rapidly. My concern is the quality of that education, I would say, generally is not that good.
So it's not really transferable. If I get a degree from the University of XYZ, I may not be able to go to Australia and get a job on the basis of that.
No, I think what we call it, in terms of universities, there's what we call the more traditional universities. And I would say that if you talk about research universities that you could compare in Australia or the UK or the States, we're talking about a handful, probably 5 to 10. You'd say, well, these are broad-based research, with med schools, with engineering, whatever. A lot of the new universities or the private universities are very strong on very cheap programs. For example, they have a lot of architecture or law, psychology, business, and they offer these programs. And I'd say, generally speaking, there's a whole discussion about accreditation and improving the standards across the board.
But these, in our country, those universities are bringing in foreign students, so there's a revenue base for them. You're just moving the revenues around in your own economy.
Sure. I think these 5 or 10 higher quality universities certainly generate international student exchange. They concentrate most of the research revenue. So we're talking about a large number of universities that, in my opinion, they're most of them have accreditation, but I would say the standard of the majority is low, and I don't feel that in a lot of other contexts they wouldn't pass the grade as being university.
Well, now let's turn back to the city. The city's 7 million people. Is it growing? Is it stasis? Where is it now?
It's growing. There's a lot of natural population growth. All the migration, rural, urban, and interregional of previous decades is tailing off slightly, but it's still a place where linked with education, it's a good idea. It's a good issue. The best educational institutions are in Santiago, so there's a problem about Santiago drawing in the best human capital, if you like, from other regions, and that's a consistent problem, and they stay. So it's still regarded as, if you want to get on, you move to Santiago. So there's brain drain from other regions, and that's a problem. And
anything being done about that to decentralize education?
Yes, there's I think the last 3 years, I don't think the program is running this year, that just finances regional universities. So if you have a university that has its central headquarters in Santiago, you can't apply. And it strengthens universities, linking those universities with their local and regional context. And some of those universities have applied with programs to actually retain their best 18-year-olds. So there is awareness of that problem. And I think the issue is wages as well in the regions compared with wages, or perceived wages, at least in Santiago, because cost of living in Santiago is very high compared with in the Chilean context, in Latin American context. So, but I still think it's regarded as, if to get on, if you like, the bright light syndrome is still there, and so we're struggling with this issue of decentralization. In November, the government of Michelle Bachelet, who came back into power in March last year, had a commission working last year. In November, they put forward a new policy for decentralization with different measures, and so there is an awareness that we need state intervention to try and make other regions more attractive for people with higher qualifications, and to stop that movement towards Santiago the rate isn't as high as before, but it still it draws on the talent of the region.
Now Santiago, and I've looked around the city, it's a nice city, a lot of greenery in the city, green cores and so forth. All right, last question. You've got this kind of immobility problem. People moving from one place to another and so on. There seem to be two solutions. One, move the people, or change the transportation system. Or maybe you do both.
I think the issue. I think we've gone as far as we can about moving people quickly through the city. So we're getting to those. We're peaking there. There's definitely a threshold issue. An issue is the localization of certain services. There are certain municipalities, for example, who are decentralizing their services. So they're trying to go out into the community, which is a great. So how do we reduce people's movement?
Yes.
But there's also an issue about, for example, the government services, the government institutions, the public administration being concentrated in Santiago Centro, where we're sitting now.
So why not decentralize
and
from the
thinking
government?
about So I mean, you need ministers, you need head of departments communicating in meetings, but a lot of people are sitting at desks, and they don't have to come into the center of Santiago to do that. So I think that's an important within the Santiago metropolitan area, but also with other regions. I know in the UK they sent defence to Bath, they sent social security to Glasgow. We can think about decentralisation through
Sydney,
public spending.
We've moved a lot of public servants to Parramatta, a place where I spent a lot of time, and now Liverpool and other places. There are two ways you can do this. One of them is to erect buildings for them there, and that's great. But why can't a public servant plug in anywhere in the area? You don't have to come into town.
Yeah.
So you could take any building, any place, and say, this is for education, this room, and this room's for defense, and this room's for whomever.
Yeah.
And you just take your laptop in and plug it in there.
Yeah.
Has any of that been thought about?
I think there's a bit of discussion here about smart cities and how that might evolve. I'm a critic of the smart city approach, which is highly sort of technological, when Santiago, our big issues around social equality. So, sustainable cities are about equality, about thinking things in a different way, in which smart city technology has a tremendous role. But we shouldn't just focus on the smart side and forget the basic, socio-political issues that are central to that, and access to technology. I mean, all of these, and connectivity. But I think exploring those, I mean, the old discussion about, people wouldn't have to move so much. And I think about our university and how we think as a university about how many of the courses we have to run on campus, how much are in class, how much stuff we could be potentially do online. And I think the universities have a role there to lead. If the universities are doing it, when people leave university and go to public agencies or private sectors, they'll say, why can't we do this as well? So universities have a tremendous potential demonstration effect, and we should explore that. I think the discussion 10 years ago that we'd all be living and working virtually hasn't worked. And I think it hasn't worked because we should explore, what are the opportunities? It's not going to happen, it's not one or the other. But we really need to think about a lot of the demand at the peak times when the system collapses is from students, secondary, higher education students, because they're all going to classes at the same time that people go to work, etc., etc. So how can we rethink, for example, at least educational timetables to actually make sure that students are in the classroom when workers are moving, for example. So we need to think be more clever about at least the educational flows.
Sure.
So I think we could be a bit more innovative in that way, and there's a lot of inertia about traditional systems of working and whatever that we can explore at the limits. And once you show that works, I mean, we shouldn't just do it. We should have the demonstration effects. And everybody said, "Oh, I like that. I want to do that. It works." And then that will happen. Then that will filter through the system.
Well, maybe you can be the first. You're running a program.
I've thought about it within CEDEOS, the Center of Sustainable Urban Development, about our staff working at home one day a week, or looking
coming
at
at different times and moving your meetings around.
Yes.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
There are three obvious lessons from Santiago. One, you have to think very carefully about where you build and what you build. Two, you have to deal with the problems of city growth intelligently, with the resources of making sure your planning scheme matches where you want to go and not haphazard. And finally, you have to deal with the problems of equity in any planning scheme or regime for you to have the results you need to make a better city.
See you again with another exciting and interesting story about future cities.